Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something you see constantly, but probably don't think much about traffic signs.
Right. They're just sort of there.
Exactly. But we've got a really fascinating study from South Carolina that digs into how long these signs actually last and, how we can best maintain them.
Yeah, this is the final report, Sign Life Expectancy, from the University of South Carolina's Engineering Department. It was done for SCDOT, the South Carolina DOT, and the Federal Highway Administration.
Okay.
And it's pretty thorough. They look at data from 1,600 SCDOT signs and also surveyed what other state DOTs are doing.
So the goal here is really understanding what makes a sign last and maybe finding smarter ways to manage them.
That's the core mission. What influences how long they stay effective, and can South Carolina improve its sign management game?
Because it really comes down to safety, doesn't it? Especially at night or in bad weather, seeing those signs clearly is critical.
Absolutely critical, and that gets us into retroreflectivity.
How well the sign bounces your headlight beams back at you.
Exactly. The FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, brought in new standards for that back in 2007, detailed in the 2009 MUTCD.
The Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. That's kind of the rule book for signs, right?
The rule book, yeah. And these standards, they weren't suggestions. They applied to all the important ones. Regulatory, warning, guide signs, object markers.
Basically all the signs you rely on.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the MUTCD gave agencies 5 main ways to, make sure their signs were up to snuff.
Okay, what were those options?
Well, you could do visual nighttime inspections, literally just looking at them.
Right.
Or use instruments to measure the retroreflectivity. Then there's estimating the expected sign life based on when it was put up.
Okay.
Also, blanket replacement, just replace everything in an area after X number of years. And finally, using control signs, monitoring a small sample very closely to judge the rest.
So lots of approaches. What has South Carolina actually been doing?
Mostly, according to this study, they rely on those nighttime visual inspections.
Just looking at them.
Yeah, but they also combine that with blanket replacement and this expected sign life idea. And that expected life, they've basically tied it to the manufacturer's warranty, which is generally around 10 years.
10 years. Okay. That sounds reasonable on the surface, but I guess the study questioned if that's really the right number for South Carolina's specific conditions.
Exactly. Is 10 years the most efficient point, or are they maybe replacing signs too early? So the researchers went out and gathered a ton of data.
From those 1,600 signs you mentioned.
Yep, over 9 months across the whole state. They tried to get a really representative sample, looking at different ages, different locations.
What kind of data were they grabbing besides just how reflective the signs were?
Oh, a whole range of stuff. The retroreflectivity measurements, of course, but also sign ID numbers, GPS coordinates, mounting height, offset from the road, color, the type of reflective sheeting,
Okay.
who made the sheeting, its facing direction, and this is interesting, the degree of shade the sign was in.
Wait, shade. How much shade hits the sign? Why track that?
That turned out to be one of the really big takeaways. It was a new variable they looked at, and it was statistically significant for all sign colors.
Really? Wow.
The likely culprit seems to be mildew growth. More shade, more moisture, more mildew. And that dulls the sign's reflectivity.
Okay. Especially in a humid place like South Carolina, that makes perfect sense. So it's not just UV breaking down the material.
Right, it suggests maybe maintenance needs to think about local environment more, like is this sign under trees most of the day?
Fascinating. Okay, besides shade, what else mattered?
Well, age, obviously.
Yeah.
That was significant for all colors. Signs just degrade over time.
Sure.
And for red signs, specifically, they found that facing northwest was also a significant factor in faster degradation.
Northwest. Huh. Any idea why? Maybe something about afternoon sun exposure on the red pigment?
It's a good possibility.
Yeah.
The intensity or angle of sunlight. So they took all this data
Right.
and built these regression models, basically mathematical formulas to predict how reflectivity changes based on factors like age, shade, direction.
And how good were these models?
They actually had higher accuracy, higher R-squared values, technically, than models from previous studies. They developed an exponential one for red signs and quadratic ones for white, yellow, and green.
Okay, so these more accurate models, what did they predict about actual sign life in South Carolina? Could they last longer than 10 years?
That's what the model suggested, yeah.
Hmm.
It looked like replacing at 10 years might often be premature just based on retroreflectivity alone.
So, potential to extend that replacement cycle.
Definitely looked that way.
Yeah.
Which, could mean real cost savings for the DOT if they aren't replacing perfectly good signs.
Makes sense. Did they look at how other states handle this? Is South Carolina typical?
They did. They sent out surveys and got responses from 16 other state DOTs. Gives you a good baseline for comparison.
And what's the common practice out there? Is everyone doing the same thing?
Well, that nighttime visual inspection, still the most popular. About 75% of respondents use it. Expected sign life was next, around 56%. When states did blanket replacement, the timing varied, but mostly it was in the 10 to 15-year range.
So similar ballpark to South Carolina's old practice.
Kind of, yeah. But interestingly, only 2 states had developed their own predictive models like the one in this USC study.
Ah,
And one state actually mentioned doing sign washing as part of their routine.
sign washing. You mentioned mildew earlier. Does cleaning them actually help maintain reflectivity?
It seems like it might. We'll definitely circle back to that. The survey also showed most states track similar basic info, sign number, direction, install date, type, but how often they update their databases. That was all over the place.
Gotcha. The study didn't just rely on surveys, though. You mentioned follow-up calls.
Yeah, they talked in more detail with folks from Utah, Minnesota, Texas, Vermont, and North Carolina DOTs.
Okay, let's hear some highlights. What did Utah say?
Utah often ties sign replacements to paving projects, which is pretty practical. Bundle the work.
Makes-
They also use their state prison system to produce a lot of common signs. Their database, though, wasn't super detailed, often missing installation dates. And they mostly use 3M sheeting.
What about Minnesota? Any different takes there?
Minnesota was interesting. They use a higher grade sheeting, type XI, for all signs. They expect those to last over 20 years.
Wow, double the standard warranty life.
Yeah. And they replace signs by corridor, trying to keep a whole stretch consistent. They're also working on improving their database for a kind of hybrid approach using control signs and nighttime checks.
Okay. Texas, big state, lots of signs.
Texas does frequent nighttime inspections every 6 months. They don't have a hard sign life number, but fine signs typically last 10-15 years. Like Utah, they use state sign shops and the prison system and contract out the really big replacement jobs.
And Vermont, smaller state.
Vermont uses a 15-year expected life based on their own study. They also do a lot of replacement during paving, like Utah, even if the sign isn't quite 15 years old yet. Prison system production again, and they have a pretty centralized management system.
Okay, lastly, North Carolina. They're neighbors with South Carolina, so maybe some relevant practices.
Definitely. North Carolina focuses on performance, not just age. If the sign's still good, it stays. Interestingly, their regional divisions manage their own inventories.
Oh, decentralized.
Yeah. And their prison system makes about 90% of their signs, tagged with a manufacture date. And here it is again, sign washing is a regular maintenance practice for them.
Okay, but that washing thing keeps coming up. Seems important. The study also looked inside South Carolina at how they actually make their signs, right?
Right, a background study on production. SCDOT has its own state sign shop in Columbia. It's been the only state-owned one since 2011.
And they crank out a lot of signs.
They do, 400 to 600 signs a day, with just 7 full-time staff. They primarily use Avery Dennison sheeting.
But they're not the only source.
Correct. The South Carolina Department of Corrections, the DOC, makes about 15–20% of SCDOT's signs.
Okay.
They use 3M sheeting, which apparently looks a bit different, thicker vertical lines, and their signs have a DOC label with the month and year.
So you can actually tell who made it? How do they physically make them? Is it all automated?
3 main ways. Screen printing for the common mass-produced signs, hand-laid application for unique ones like specific distance markers, and extruded paneling for those big overhead and side of the highway signs.
Pretty standard techniques then.
Seems so. The researchers visited shops in a few other states, Connecticut, New Mexico, Iowa, and found similar processes.
Okay, so we've got the degradation factors like shade, comparisons with other states, how the signs are made. Let's get to the bottom line. What were the major findings and recommendations for SCDOT?
All right, the core finding really comes from combining their predictive models, historical replacement data, and looking at older signs still in service, especially in Spartanburg.
What did they find there?
They found that most of the Type 3 signs older than 12 years were still meeting the MUTCD retroreflectivity standards.
So still perfectly functional past 12 years.
In many cases, yes.
Yeah.
And when they looked at why signs were replaced at 10, 11, or 12 years, it was very rarely because of poor retroreflectivity.
Ah, so likely replaced due to damage, knockdowns, or just the blanket policy.
Exactly. So all this evidence together led them to conclude that SCDOT could confidently extend its standard replacement interval to 12 years.
From 10 to 12, that 2-year difference across the whole state must represent pretty significant savings.
Potentially huge savings, yeah, without compromising safety. based on the data.
What else did they suggest SCDOT do?
Well, they recommended looking into using control signs. Set up specific signs in different districts, monitor them regularly with a retroreflectometer.
The measurement tool.
Right. And use that real-world performance data to see if maybe, in some conditions, signs could last even longer than 12 years. It pushes towards a more performance-based approach.
Okay, more data-driven decisions. And what about the washing?
Oh, yeah, a very strong recommendation there, especially for signs in shady spots.
Because of the mildew.
Exactly. Their own test showed washing boosted retroreflectivity by an average of 22.5%. They calculated that could translate to about 2 extra years of life for yellow, white, and green signs. And get this, potentially 5 extra years for red signs.
5 years? Just from washing? That's incredible.
Isn't it? It seems like such a simple thing. They even pointed to the manufacturer's guidelines on how to do it properly. pH-neutral soak, soft cloth, avoid pressure washing the edges, specific solvents for tough grime if needed, but test first.
So clean your signs, people. What else? Any other materials or procedures?
They suggested SCDOT periodically evaluate using that Type XI sheeting, like Minnesota does, given its potentially much longer lifespan.
But weigh the pros and cons.
Right. They mentioned other states' experiences. Delaware uses it exclusively. Nebraska found it might offset lighting costs. Louisiana didn't see much difference for drivers. Nevada had some concerns about a halo effect, so it needs careful consideration.
Makes sense. And any tweaks to how SCDOT keeps records?
Just a few practical things.
Yeah.
Add a field in the replacement database to note why a sign was replaced. Was it end of life, damage, etc.?
Good data point.
Add that degree of shade variable to the main sign database, since it proved so important. And maybe use a simple phone or tablet app during installation to quickly update the signs facing direction in the database. Just better data hygiene, really.
All seems very logical, based on the findings. So wrapping it up, the big picture is South Carolina can likely get more life out of its signs, move to a 12-year cycle, save money.
Especially if they add washing to their maintenance routine and maybe start using control signs to fine-tune things even further.
And the really surprising factor in all this?
Definitely the shade. How much difference that seemingly small environmental factor makes, mostly due to mildew. It wasn't really emphasized in previous studies like this.
Yeah, for me, that's the aha moment, that something as basic as washing a sign because it's sitting in the shade can add years to its effective life.
Just pretty striking. Simple maintenance, big impact.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other subtle, maybe overlooked environmental things are affecting the infrastructure we rely on every single day? Definitely some food for thought next time you're out on the road.